Well, hello everyone. My name is Doug Gay and I teach theology at the University of Glasgow, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this next in our series of vodcasts for COP26, which are being distributed on the Theology and Religious Studies website from the University of Glasgow. And I'm really delighted to have two guests with me from two communities which are very well known, although some of you may be encountering them for the first time. So we'll try and introduce you to them here right at the beginning. I'm going to mention that we'd hope to have a third community in the room as well, Sojourners community, and unfortunately, because of some timing changes, the person from Sojourners who'd been in Glasgow with us at COP isn't able to make it to be with us today. So we're grateful to them for their willingness to participate. And on a personal note, since I was 18 years old, these three communities that I've mentioned have all been extremely important in my own formation and influential upon me. The Sojourners community based in Washington, D.C. in the United States of America, the Iona community based here in Scotland, and the Taizé community based in France. Why have they been important, and why are they still important for us today? And what might they have to say to COP? We're going to explore some of this in a conversation just now. So I'm going to go first of all to Brother Matthew, who's in Glasgow and has come from Taizé, arrived at the weekend for COP26. And Matthew, could you introduce yourself and also tell us a little bit about Taizé in case somebody's encountering this who doesn't know much about the community?
Sure, thank you, Doug. No, believe it or not, it's 35 years ago this evening since I entered Taizé Community, in 1986. I'm from the north of England originally. Forgive me if I've lost a lot of my English idiom, but we speak English a lot with non-native speakers now, so you lose a bit of the intonation and everything. I was born in the north of England in Yorkshire.
You still sound like you come from Yorkshire.
Yeah, but I first encountered Taizé. There was a diocesan youth pilgrimage from Bradford and from the Anglican diocese, and I saw this on the parish bulletin and thought, I don't want to go on this. I don't openly say that I am Christian. I go along to church, but I keep myself to myself. And it was really when I went off to university that I met for the first time other young people seeking Christ of my own age. And it was one of them who suggested that we go to Taizé. I knew the music already a lot. We sung it in our churches. And I think many people know Taizé through the music more than the community itself. But Taizé was founded in 1940. Brother Roger, Swiss Reformed pastor, who came to Taizé in the middle of the Second World War. He was looking for a place to found a community of brothers with the idea of living a sign of reconciliation. He always told the story about his grandmother who'd lived during the First World War in France and who'd seen a lot of suffering. She was Protestant, but she used to go and pray in the Catholic Church, which at that time wasn't really done. And she stayed until it became very, very dangerous, and then she had to go back to the family in Switzerland. And he always told the story of her arriving exhausted from France and saying, Christians, they speak about a God of love, but they don't love each other. And if they could love each other, then perhaps more people would believe in the gospel. There'd be a greater chance for peace in the world. And those words of his grandmother were like a seed that were planted in his heart, and which later matured into this calling. God speaks to us through people around us, and that was very important to him. And then he arrived in 1940 in Taizé, lived the first 2 years alone, welcomed people who were in danger, among them some Jewish people, political refugees. And after the war, the first brothers came and joined him. He imagined a community of 12 brothers. It seems it was a real question when the 13th arrived. But fortunately, he decided, yes, we'll keep on going. God is sending us these people. And yeah, the community grew slowly during the 50s and 60s. And then all of a sudden, young people started to come. And at first, the brothers were terrified. They built a house 5 kilometers away from Taizé and said to these young people, you can stay there. We've got our life. But they kept coming. And it was the 1960s. It was the time of all these, revolutions in youth culture. And Brother Roger understood something. He was very intuitive. He understood that if we didn't offer a space for these young people, then they weren't going to find their place in the church. They weren't going to find an identification with the gospel. And so they began to welcome young people in Taizé, and it revolutionized our life. It meant a whole change in our liturgy, in our way of offering hospitality. And that's continued to today. We are around 90 brothers now, of different Protestant and Catholic backgrounds, and we try to understand what God is saying to us in this particular moment, not to be too kind of fixed on particular ideas or something that we have to put across. Reconciliation is the heart of our life, but we welcome people simply as they are. They come to take part in the prayer 3 times a day. It's a Bible study, but we offer a space where people can be and reflect and share together.
No, that's super. And so one of the things that's so interesting is that clearly there were things stirring around the response to the Second World War, and the story of the Iona community, Ruth, is very much bound up with that same period, isn't it? And some of the same themes. Yeah,
and it's just great to be with you, Matthew, because I have grown up in the Iona community knowing that part of our mythology is that, in Scotland there was the Iona community, and in France there was the Taizé community, and they both kind of grew through these charismatic leaders, Brother Roger, and then for us it was George MacLeod, who had been deeply influenced by war. For George MacLeod, who was the founder of the Iona community, it was initially the First World War, and then he founded the Iona community in the 1930s, 1938. But obviously then we were plunged straight into the Second World War. But always at the heart of our community was the call to peace, and that would be the word that would be at the heart of our work. And I think that's going to be a thread for me through this conversation, that because our commitment to peace then evolved in the 1960s to a commitment to peace with justice, and then it evolved in the 1980s to a commitment with eco-justice. So there's a really interesting thread all the way back to our founding. But our community was founded not on Iona, ironically. It was founded in Glasgow in the 1930s at a time of deep depression and poverty. George MacLeod was the minister of Govan Parish Church, and folks were saying to him that the church was not for them. What was the church doing for them in their time of unemployment and poverty and hunger? And various factors were at play, which then resulted in him taking a group of unemployed craftspeople from all over Scotland, the central belt of Scotland, and a group of trainee clergy, all men at that time, to Iona to rebuild the ruins of the living quarters of the Benedictine monastery there. So Iona is an island off the coast of Mull, which is an island off the coast of Scotland. So it's an island off an island, if you like, just in case anyone listening hasn't been. But it's where St. Columba came in the 6th century and brought Christianity to the north of Britain from Ireland, and founded a monastery there and went out from there to share the good news. So we are inheritors of a very long tradition. And again, I'm going to thread back to that tradition a little bit in our later conversation. But we were founded in the 1930s, big hiatus for the war, but that was the impetus for us to do work with young people around reconciliation, peace and justice, and the alleviation of poverty. So our big things are working with young people the renewal of worship. So again, you might have heard of the Iona community through the Wild Goose Resource Group and various songs that we sing, and the renewal of worship. And then also through the third big element in our kind of charitable aims is working in the area of learning and equipping people. And we now run the Abbey on Iona not as a retreat centre, not as a hotel, as a community. So people go and live there, and we welcome guests to come and join us in worship, very much like Taizé, twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day at the height of the season, living in community, taking part in the tasks of everyday life, sharing the common life. And I first went to Iona as a small child, and I lived there as a child. Went to school on the island. I grew up, I guess, thinking that was a normal thing to do, to live in a ecumenical, intentional Christian community. It was only later when I moved to central belt of Scotland that I realised that was not normal. But I now live in Cumbria in the north of England, so not far from where you were born, Matthew. And I worship as a Quaker and as a Presbyterian. And I guess that's really important for me, that I sit lightly to my denominational belonging. I'm a member of 2 religious organisations, if you like, 2 religious churches, 2 church denominations. But my belonging is to the worldwide church. And I get that sense of belonging through being part of the now ecumenical Iona community. So we were initially only men. Now it is women and men, and all shades in between, and all denominations, and including doubters. Many people in our community are very sceptical about the role of the church, but committed to the renewal of the church and the renewal of worship in the church.
And you are the leader of the Iona community. I
happen to be the leader. It's like this, we have this image of the wild geese. There's if you can imagine a skein of geese, and the lead goose flies for a while and then goes to the back and has the rest while another goose takes on. A bit like religious communities, other religious communities, but that's a bit like us. So I'm in this role for a maximum of 7 years, and then I'll fall back as a tired goose to the back of the skein. But yeah, I'm employed full time as the leader of the worldwide movement. So we have about 270 members who commit to a 4-fold rule, and then we have about 2,000 associate members and friends worldwide who commit to the same rule but are not held in the same level of accountability. So, and we use that word in a very welcoming way. Accountability doesn't mean judgment. It means really being strongly supportive of one another to live the rule, which includes daily prayer and Bible study. It includes commitment to justice and peace, a commitment to sharing our time, our talents, and the earth's resources, and a commitment to supporting and upholding the life of the community.
So I want to move on, and I want to try and go into the story of for both of your communities of how your involvement with and commitment to issues of ecology, of concern for creation, of the stewardship of the earth, however it's described in your tradition. Matthew, can I go back to you and say, how have these things grown, if you like, within? Were they always very important, or is it something that, as I suppose many of us have grown in our consciousness of them, so the community has grown? And what form does that take in your life?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think at the outset there was very much an involvement in agriculture and local supply chains, as we would say today. There was a brother who organised a cooperative farm which brought together local farmers and to pool their resources, because we're in a country area, and that was the only way to live. It was a way of showing solidarity with all those around us. But I think it has to be said that with the coming of the young people, then that took more and more of our time, and to hold on to such commitments was no longer possible. I think there's always been an attention, to the beauty of creation, to the way in which we arrange the church, to use natural materials, to use local work people, craftspeople, tradespeople, and things like that. Have always been very important. But although there've been, a handful of brothers who've always been very attentive to these questions, I think it's really been in the last 5 years that as a community we've become more and more aware of the urgency. And that's happened through young people. Being attacked by 15-year-olds in the church after evening prayer. Who say, what are you doing with all these disposable wrappers? What are you doing about these the heating that doesn't work very well and there's no insulation? And in a way, it's them who shook us up. I think that's always been a mark of our community, that we don't have a fixed line that we follow, but we try to listen to what people are saying now, and to meet them in that, to accompany them in that. Whose voices are we prepared to listen to?
That's such a great answer in line. The John Bell and Joe Love of the Iona community led a service of worship, a vigil in Glasgow Cathedral last week, and one of the readings was the reading from Acts, which spoke about your sons and daughters shall prophesy. And that sense of learning from young people is very striking, I think, and of course, it makes perfect sense, as a community welcoming young people. I love the idea that they've been giving to you, if you like, and being a source of renewal for you and awakening for you, as well as you supporting them.
Now, I don't want to quote too many popes in this podcast, but when Pope John Paul II came to visit us, in 1986, it was just before I became a brother, and he said that the young people who visit you, they're a gift and a means, to keep you small and like a springtime always bursting forth. And I think that's very true for us, that there's a great privilege, in welcoming these people who come to be with us, young or even older, and they become the means through which the Spirit of God often speaks to us. We're a monastic community. We're not kind of openly engaged out in the world. But if we lock ourselves behind our cloister walls, then I'm not sure that's the best thing. And lockdown as well took away the young people, and meant that we had to reflect a lot on our life. And really, the last 2 years, this whole question of what they call in French, I'm not sure if it's the same in English, but they speak about the ecological transition. This is this moving into a mode where questions of the environment really become a directing line in our lives, and that really the last 2 years has become very strong.
No, that's great. And Ruth, I suppose I want to ask the same question of you as well. Within the Life of the Iona community, when there were these big words like peace and then justice, when did these other words, which, if you like, green words, begin to become more important in your story as a community?
Well, I will come to that, but I want to just pick up the thread here, because there's a woman called Eve Sharples who's one of our young adult group members, and she's been to Taizé a lot, and she's also part of the Iona community, and she'd probably be, I don't know, putting words in her mouth, I imagine her saying, let's just work, why don't Taizé and Iona work together on this? It doesn't matter that you're in different countries, that you're different parts of the world, because for her, it's all about the heartbeat of God, I suppose, the heartbeat of the life of the world is what's important. And she's shaking us up. We've just renovated this 12th century Benedictine monastery, and she led the first guest week in the Abbey this May just gone, and it was called a Wild Week, and it was tremendous. And it was all about being in touch with the earth, and for her, she was on the march on Saturday in Glasgow with me, and she was saying, Ruth, we've got to sing, let's keep singing, we can't stop singing. And she kept us singing the whole way along. The energy that she and the other young folk brought and the focus that they bring is tremendous. So I want to pay tribute to Eve and all the folks who are under 30 who are telling us the way to go, and who are, I love that notion from the Pope of the past, but the springtime in the young people. I mean, back to Doug's question, our environmental emphasis emerged in the 1980s. It was in 1987, our Justice and Peace Commitment, which was first penned in 1966 as an international commitment to peace, and that was straight out of the war era. For the first time, there'd always been a commitment to peace, but for the first time, the leadership then wrote down what that meant, and it was very much about anti-nuclear and saying we will cast out all weapons of mass destruction. We will be against all weapons of mass destruction. That's been a very strong theme for us. But then very quickly it was realised that you can't have peace without justice, or justice without peace. So justice came in, and in 1987, that's when when the peace commitment was rewritten as a justice and peace commitment, and the word eco-justice came in then too. I don't know. I mean, it was the time of an awakening, I suppose, in the 1960s and 70s to the power of the earth and the beauty of the earth. But I don't think the focus really came as in the sense that we've got it now in terms of a climate catastrophe until really quite recently, 5 or 6 years ago. We've got members like John and Chris Polhill who live in the Midlands of England, who've been campaigning on environmental issues for decades. We've got many of our members who have been at the forefront of eco-justice and doing very practical things in their churches and in their communities, and many eco-congregations. But as a community, I don't think we really began to think very seriously about it until we were renovating the Abbey, and that project began 7 years ago, and we realised we had an opportunity to do something with this building that was a sign for the world, and also with the local community, with the island community on Iona. So we've been working hand in hand with the island community to support the whole campaign to make the island of Iona an eco-island, and to support the renewable heating system that is still to be installed there. But I guess the answer is 1987, Doug, and since then we've been campaigning for and supporting the call for a deeper theology of the environment, and learning from great writers on those themes. And then most recently, we have now launched what we call our common concern networks, which are networks that gather together people who share a concern, a bit like how the Quakers use the word concern. It's a passion or an impetus that you can't put down. And we've got 7 of these common concern networks. And the most active one in the last year has been around the environment because of COP26. And that has, because of the pandemic, we've been enabled to meet together globally in a way that we've never really have imagined. And don't for a minute think that our global meeting is zero carbon altogether, but it's much better than us traveling the world in airplanes. And so we've been meeting globally to look at how we can respond to the environmental crisis, and that would be the latest iteration of our collective commitment to environmental justice. I should also say that about 10 years ago, so before the renovation of the Abbey, one of our members, John Dale, for his project when he was joining, committed to developing a carbon accounting toolkit for the community members. And so since then, we have been asking our members to account for how we use the Earth's resources. So we do that every year. We submit an account of that. Now we've not done that rigorously in the last few years, and now COP has given us the impetus again. We must do this again. So we're going to reignite that part of our commitment. But John was ahead of his time in our context 10 years ago when he shared with us a carbon accounting tool and began to let us see just how much carbon each of us consumes in our lives. And how to be stewards of the earth. And I guess that's the impetus. The impetus is from scripture and from tradition, that we're not the inventors of the whole notion of stewarding of the earth, as the company here will attest. But we need to be reminded of it all the time and what that actually means. And I guess actually just my last little thought is that, our context on Iona specifically and with Columba is in a place of wilderness, if you like. And the place where scripture was handwritten many times over, ultimately creating the Book of Kells. And it is said that many of the monks who were transcribing scripture at those times were writing small poems inspired by nature as they sat outside and heard the birds singing and had the breeze blowing, and they would write these nature poems. And I guess in our liturgy and in our prayers and in our singing, we've been inspired by that thread of spirituality back to some of our forebears.
That's a perfect lead into where I want to go next. And again, I want to go back to Matthew. I want to talk about, to ask you about spirituality, because I suspect that on the one hand, lots of the young people who come to Taizé are very impatient potentially about action, and COP, Greta Thunberg and others, no more blah, 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 enough talking, we need to act. But in a sense, the fact that they also come to Taizé maybe says something about what needs to be paired with action. And this is where we maybe open up that word spirituality. To what extent do you think that the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis? And how does the spirituality of Taizé speak to that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I see in this movement of young people an incredible longing for a sense of belonging. And of struggling together for a common cause. So many young people have felt isolated and frustrated, especially during the pandemic. It's compounded it. And here is something which they can identify with, because it's a question about the future. And that, has encouraged them to walk together, to march together. Brother Roger always spoke about struggle and contemplation. He put the two things together. Later he changed it a bit to the inner life and human solidarity, but it's the same thing really. And I think we notice periods where there is a greater tendency to struggle. And perhaps at those moments we need as well to open a space for prayer. And that's what I've noticed in the prayers that we've held these days in Glasgow. Last night at the cathedral, there were two young women from Scandinavia who familiar with Taizé, who came along to there, who were in tears at the end, and said, we've been in these. They were delegates, and they've been in the meetings, and they were so frustrated, with what had been going on, and they needed to be able to put that before God. And I think there, the text we read last night, it was the second story of the creation, with this call of God to till and keep the earth, but which is then followed by a mission: you may eat all the fruit from all the trees, but not from the tree of life and death. It's followed by a prohibition. And holding together, calling, permission, and prohibition. For me, that's an important theme at the moment. There's so much that we can do, and I think it's important to underline that. Otherwise, our spirituality becomes the prophets of doom. And there's a call to be people of hope as well. To accept that there are some things which lead to death. I think wherever we meet people in the depths of their hearts, there where they are moved as a person, there's a spiritual dimension which is there always. And in the churches, are we ready to welcome that? It's perhaps not a question for present company, but it's very easy to fall into the lines of doctrine and what's accepted, what's sound, as they used to say when I was a youth. No, we need to meet people where they're at.
Ruth, I'm sure again you'll have been nodding and resonating with that. I mean, people come a long way sometimes, especially when they go to Iona. I mean, I know the Iona communities all over the world, or when they gather for prayer in ways which are connected to the liturgies and the songs of Iona. And so that sense of a spiritual quest and many of these people who are in the Iona community, I know, are deeply involved in action. What do you think the spirituality of the Iona community brings to this whole question of the relationship between struggle and action and contemplation or
I love that. The struggle, contemplation, duality. I've wrestled with the word spirituality almost all my life, wondering what on earth does it mean, and casting it off and thinking it's not a useful word, and then absorbing it and working for an organisation that had it in its title for a while, and I've come to understand spirituality is that which moves you at your deepest level. Of whatever religious tradition you are, so whatever moves you, and to move is a very active thing, isn't it? To be moved, either emotionally or physically moved. So there's an intrinsic connection between things of the spirit and things of the world. We talk about the material realm and the spiritual realm, and George MacLeod famously talked about Iona as a thin place where the divide between the things material and things spiritual is as thin as gossamer. And I like to think that in an integrated life, in daily life, we live in that in those realms all the time. What I find fascinating is that two things. One is carved into the stonework of the south-facing window in the Abbey Church on Iona. You can just make out a cat on one side and a monkey on the other side. These were the symbols in the Benedictine tradition, which the building was built in, of contemplation and action, struggle and contemplation, I guess. And the invitation is there for us to hold that tension, to walk that line, to walk that, not that line so much as to walk into that space between the two all the time. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is a conversation I had with some of our young volunteers this summer. We gathered on the wee hill outside the Abbey on Iona, and I just said, help me understand what it is that draws you to Iona, because we're trying to renew our ministry amongst young people and through young people. And they were very clear. They said, we think what you do in worship and how you make that real in your actions as members is really attractive and important. Please carry on doing that. So they were looking for that gift of contemplation, the space to reflect. And I don't know about this thing about doctrine, and it's an interesting conversation maybe for another time, but I think some place to have a really gritty, earthy conversation about the stuff that matters and how we collectively over the millennia have formulated responses out of faith to that. If you call that doctrine, that's fine. For me, this is about the rule of life in the community that we live now, and it's not perfect. We need to keep evolving it. But they're asking us to carry on reflecting, holding silence, praying around that, and then taking action. So I think of again the young folk that came on the march on Saturday with us, and we're dancing and singing and weeping and raging. They used the words rage and anger in their songs about what the world is doing, what we are all doing to the climate. So for me, this is a very familiar territory, the territory between spirituality and action, or faith and action, or contemplation and struggle, or cats and monkeys. It sums up so much of daily life, the rise and the fall, the ebb and the flow, all part of the natural world also. But it has to be rooted in I guess the cry of the neediest in our world, and who are the folks that need to receive the gifts of life most fully, and who are the folks that need to hear the cries of the poor most fully. And we're in that space, all of us, augmenting and making louder the voice of the neediest and bending the ear of the most powerful.
You've both mentioned this, and it's in the conversations I've been having with people for the vodcasts and around COP. One of the things I've been asking people, everyone about, is this theme of hope, Matthew. And again, I think it's particularly poignant for young people. I I teach a course in political theology at the University of Glasgow, and at the end of that course, in the final class, the last twice I've taught the course, I've said to the young people, who do you think were more hopeful, your generation or your parents' generation? And the younger ones in the class, without exception, said our parents' generation. And as a parent myself, I find that very difficult. And so, Matthew, when young people come to Taizé, this theme of hope, is this something you feel that people are struggling for? And how do you respond to questions about hope? Because the whole ecological situation generates a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of dystopian talk about the future. How do you deal with that when that comes up in conversations around the table at Taizé?
It's a very difficult question, because I don't think there's a set answer. You got to see who you've got opposite you, and first of all to listen to them and to walk with them. And one thing which, if we're talking about young people, they realise when you're just giving pat answers, and they don't accept that. But what is important is giving them that space, being patient, so that the hope rises up within them, And I think hope is renewed often when we feel taken seriously in our anxieties and in our worries, and they're not just fobbed away. There's something very liberating in being listened to well, which can give us strength to take the next steps which you feel called to. And I think affirming presences, and okay, that there are times when you have to be clear. You can't just say everything is marvelous what you're saying, but an affirming presence, that's what many people need today, because they are insecure. The world is confusing. Things are changing incredibly rapidly, or we've been told that they're changing incredibly rapidly, and there is a genuine emergency there before us. But it was the theme of last year in Taizé. Brother Alois, our current prior, he wrote this text, which in French it's the theme of your vodcast, Hope Against All Hope. We translate a little bit differently into English, hoping in season and out of season. I think that's the actual quote from Scripture. We speak about hope, but without saying this is what you should do. It's a question of opening up space where people can rediscover a hope which the Spirit of God perhaps places within them. And hope, I think, in a Christian sense, for me, it's always this trust in a future reality, in the way in which it becomes present already now in some way. And there, I think I come back again and again to the Easter mysteries, to the cross and to the resurrection, to the renewal of all things, the promise of God to make all things new. We don't know how that's going to happen, but that's our faith. And that's what moves us. That's what enables us to continue on this journey.
And I suppose I think of Taizé as being somewhere where people encounter some of the long rhythms of the Christian tradition, and Iona as well, potentially, and that there's a sense in which the liturgical cycle that you've just referred to makes people wait in places where they have to confront difficulty and darkness, and then leads them through, the story of Jesus into a place where there is light and celebration and joy and hope, and in a sense that there's something about going through that journey year by year, which maybe teaches people to live in both places.
Yeah, and we do that week by week. It's every weekend that we celebrate Easter in Taizé. On Friday evening, there's a prayer around the cross, and the evening of Saturday, a celebration of the resurrection, and to put the Easter mysteries at the heart of our life. Yeah, and it's been very striking these days. I was a little bit hesitant about the prayer around the cross in Presbyterian Glasgow, but people have been coming and praying around the cross. And it's been very moving. It's been very moving. There's a need, for the symbol, even something stronger than symbol, that we receive when we kneel in front of the cross. Yeah.
Ruth, you mentioned hope as well, and I suppose I just want to turn that question back towards you and say, how are you wrestling with this theme of hope and with the need for hope in these times in the Iona community?
Well, it's a great question, and I think I was influenced by a book by Julie Neras called Apprenticed to Hope, and she talks about the difference between optimism and hope. And I think that's a really important distinction. And I like to think, and this may be relevant to COP in Scotland, but if optimism is like iron brew, you need a shot of it every so often to get you through the next wave, the next kind of little dip in your day, any bit of sugary drink. Then hope is your single malt. It's something there for the long haul. And I think looking for those moments of hope, even in the pain and the rage. And there's a brilliant book by Christian Aid of prayers and reflections called Rage and Hope. And I think they're great bedfellows that out of rage, it's not just anger, it's something more than anger. It's utter fury, that kind of white hot fury that is tapping into a deep source of energy, which is both the root of destruction and of delight. Tapping into that source of energy, out of which can come this deep longing, deep hope, which doesn't mean everything is rosy and sugary and bright, but it does mean that we have to wait in the pain. And taking the lead from yourself, Matthew, I think absolutely the Easter story is our root story here, that the disciples on Holy Saturday did not know when the agony would lift. We know that it was 3 days, but they did not know that. They believed, they trusted, they had faith, but they had to wait in the not knowing. And we too quickly in our liturgical patterns skip through Saturday knowing that there's this glorious Easter Sunday, and we don't dwell in the not knowing enough. And I wonder if that's where the hope really is given birth. It's in the ability to really rest in the not knowing. If we just get through Saturday with the iron brew of optimism, it's not going to sustain us for the long haul. And so there's something about dwelling in the pain, but not being overcome by it. And I think that's where hope is born. But I worked for a number of years for an organisation called A Place for Hope, and it was all of our conversations, they were about reconciliation and peace, and they were all about being able to dwell with integrity and with our eyes wide open to the pain of the world, knowing that there was a kingdom just a breath away, that we were living the kingdom now. So, and young people and all people coming to the Iona community, and I guess I want to be wary of too much young and old kind of dichotomizing. Certainly in the Iona community, we've got a huge range of ages. And I think, I know some very hopeful older people who have a utter trust that the best is yet to come, and that what we're doing now is planting seeds of hope for the future. And the key thing is that we keep talking, keep looking for the new signs. So that's where the Eve Sharples of this world and the other young folk who are knocking on our door and begging us to use our facilities in ways that are environmentally sustainable, they are showing us the way. And it's Chris and John Polhill in their eco garden in the Midlands in their 70s doing exactly the same thing and showing us the way with tirelessly. So the hope is in those seeds of hope, those signs of new life. And for me as a Christian, rooted in that Easter story, for sure.
Final question for both of you. This is being recorded in the middle of the second week in COP, and people, there are all sorts of phrases about people going into the tunnel and intense negotiations going on. So the final question is about COP26, and what do you think this means? Matthew, and you and Sebastian have come to Glasgow to be present here. What do you think the significance of this gathering is, and why was it important for you to come and be here and be a presence here?
Funny, when I left Taizé, I said to the brothers, I'm not quite sure why we're going to Glasgow. I'll understand later. And yeah, I think that's beginning to kind of become true now. We went and stood outside the entrance to the Blue Zone a couple of evenings ago. To be there, in the midst of all this tension and rage and fury, as Ruth's been saying, it was something very, very important. And to realize that these activists, so to speak, are normal people.
Yeah,
it's not people who are extremists as such. And for me, that has been a big eye opener to see the concerns really, face on. And I think, we'll see what agreements come out of COP26, but to see the place that young people have taken, I don't think it's been given to them. That they've taken, and the voice has been heard. Will it be acted upon? That remains to be seen. The demonstration, I wasn't there, we just arrived in the evening, but the demonstrations the marches on Saturday that were peaceful, for a major gathering like this, it's quite remarkable. And I think that shows the seriousness of people's concern. We can hope for some kind of concrete engagement in the pledges that come out of the final document. But it's also each one of us that has to act. The decisions from on high are very important, but if there's not that grassroots movement, then in the end, I'm not sure it's going to. I don't know. Perhaps I shouldn't say things like that, but it's it's a case of continuing the mobilization. Not thinking when COP26 is finished, wow, that was great. There's somebody surely who's going to say it was a marvelous triumph. But no, the journey continues.
The struggle continues was a phrase someone very precious down in the community, Graham Moll, who sadly died in the last couple of years, and he used to sign off a lot of his emails with the phrase in Portuguese, "A luta continua," the struggle continues. So, final question for you as well, Ruth, about COP. I mean, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about in theology and religious studies at Glasgow, and I suppose I've been thinking about with others in the church, as somebody who comes from the Christian tradition in Glasgow, is what does it mean that this has come to us in a sense? Well, it meant that we had to try and be hospitable, but it seems to me that that maybe the Spirit is posing questions to the church in Scotland through this coming and on our doorstep. What does it mean for COP26 to be here in Glasgow and to be in Scotland, do you think?
Well, I think the momentum is building, and part of our responsibility as people in the UK and in Glasgow in particular, or in Scotland in particular, is to maintain that momentum. I have a very vivid image in my head of the interreligious leaders on the first Saturday of COP gathering in George Square, and the amount of coverage that gathering got was remarkable. And I think, and I can only begin to imagine the hours of work that went in for the previous year or 2 years, all the consensus building, all the relationship building, all the conversations, all the planning that led to those kind of almost minuscule moments, but they were powerful moments. And we need to maintain that momentum also, that we have a collective voice that transcends. It's not just about the lowest common denominator between our different traditions. And I'm not just talking about the different Christian traditions, but all the religious traditions, where we really know who we are and we're confident in who we are. And we don't need to worry about losing who we are, but we allow ourselves to subsume that for a greater good, which is about the survival of the planet. And I speak as a committed Christian, wanting to walk alongside my dear beloved friends in the Muslim and the Jewish and the Baha'i traditions and all these other traditions. So I think that's the gift of COP for me. That will be a lasting memory, and I'm so grateful to all my colleagues in the various religious traditions who've helped make that happen. I also think there has been an awakening in the streets of Glasgow about, the power and the potential of the ordinary voice. And I was part of that march in the rain, standing in Kelvin Grove Park for 3 hours, waiting to be told we can walk. And then we walked a very short distance, and we talked and we sang, and the people out of the windows of the Glasgow tenements waving their flags and encouraging us to carry on walking, along with the skeptics of whom passed us in the street on the way there and was very, very clear in no uncertain terms exactly what he thought of us. And I won't repeat here what he said to us. And the street preachers who at the end said, "Save your souls first and then save the planet." And I'm thinking, we live in a liminal space between all of these extremities. And we have to make a choice about who we stand alongside. And I absolutely want to stand alongside others who share a passion for the care of this earth and the faith that we express on it and on the earth and in the God who created it. These people come from all shades of life, religious and otherwise. And I think the call for us now is to find ways to act together. And I would love to find a way for Taizé Sojourners, Iona community, other faith communities, Agape, others across Europe and the world to really find a very clear collective voice that transcends the individual voices that we each have and will continue to have. And so for me, that's a real bit of energy and impetus and hope. It won't be the answer. I feel very despairing a lot of the time, but in the Iona community, we will maintain our commitment to peace and justice, and we'll probably rewrite our justice and peace commitment as a result. We'll probably sharpen it again because it's an evolving thing. And we'll have learned out of COP what it is we now need to do even more fully. But we do it best with other people, and that includes departments of religion and theology, and it includes colleague communities around the world, Corrymeela being another one.
Thank you so much, both of you. Two phrases that come into my head at the end of this: "Wait for the Lord, His day is near," which is something I learned to sing from Taizé, and then "Inspired by Love and Anger," which is something I learned to sing during Iona. And I'm so grateful to you both. You're busy people, and you've taken time to share your time with us and your reflections during this podcast series. So we're in your debt, and thank you both so much for being willing to take part.
Thanks, Doug.